One way to think about what makes you aware of yourself is an acquaintance with meta-representations. You're going through trying to figure out what's in the minds of other people. In the process of doing that, you're then working or analyzing or reflecting or reporting or judging your own internal representations, your own experiences. And that, in turn, by means of higher order thought theory, defines what it is that you're conscious of, right? Now, all these things are speculations, but I do think that adults act as external selves for developing children. I have a great memory of my first daughter when she was maybe 2 years old. She runs towards me and then she falls 2 meters from me. And then I see her raising up, looking at me, and literally silently asking, how should I feel about this? Looking at me and how should I feel about this? And I knew that if I expressed anxiety, because I thought that she could have hurt herself, she would begin screaming. But that if I smiled and expressed reassurance, she would just stand up and go. And that's what I did, and that's what she did. And I had this sense that she was literally using me as an external self. This happened. How should I feel about it? Because I have no idea. And then I supplied the meta-representation that she couldn't muster in her own consciousness at that point in time.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Wandering Thoughts. Today I'm joined by Professor Axel Cleeremans. Professor Axel, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be talking to you and to be able to learn from you. I think it's good to begin with if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and about your area of expertise.
Yes, so I'm professor of cognitive science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, which is a francophone university in Brussels, Belgium. But I'm actually paid by the National Fund for Scientific Research in Belgium. So my main job is to do research. Teaching is a secondary obligation, so to speak. And so I'm a research director with the National Fund for Scientific Research, and I've done my entire career with them. I work mostly on consciousness, basically. Initially, I started working on unconscious cognition, and in particular on something called implicit learning. That is, what is it that you can learn about without being aware of what it is that you're learning? And then at the end of the 80s, early 90s, or let's say middle of the 90s, consciousness became a topic of its own, basically, and it took part of the field by fire, really. And I was sort of taken by this renewed interest in what remains now one of the big mysteries of 21st century science.
Okay, so you started with implicit learning. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the mechanisms of implicit learning?
Yes, it's a big question. But essentially, there's different degrees, perhaps, but there's no question that plasticity and learning can take place without awareness. You have all sorts of organisms that can be conditioned, for instance, in different ways, and so react in an adaptive manner to experience, to what it is they're encountering, to the contingencies that are present in their environment. And Otto Reber is the person who put the question of unconscious or implicit learning, as he called it, to avoid the idea that it was completely unconscious. Basically, I think it was to soften the pill a little bit that he used the word implicit as opposed to unconscious. But he designed a series of experiments that showed that people were sensitive to the structure of nonsensical sequences of letters PST, VVPS, TX, VVT, so on and so forth, that they were exposed to. And unwittingly, all those sequences of nonsensical sequences of letters had been generated by what's called a finite state grammar, which is a very simple oriented graph that you can traverse. So it's arcs connecting nodes, basically, and each arc bears a label, so a letter in this case. And so by circulating in this little diagram, you can generate sequences of letters. And so it is a grammar because it defines what letter can occur in which context, basically. It defines legal sequences of letters versus non-grammatical sequences of letters. And the core finding that Reber documented is that simply asking people to memorize such sequences of letters, all generated by the grammar, made them sensitive to which features defined a sequence of letters as a grammatical sequence. And so, but people remained unaware of the basis of the discrimination, right? They couldn't tell you, oh yes, I indicated that this sequence of letters is grammatical because I know that a P can never follow an X in the strings I've seen. And so this learning that made them perform a little bit better than chance reflects an incidental sensitivity to structure, basically. So it reflects the fact that we are able to sort of scoop up structure in the environment without intention to do so, without explicit instruction, and without a clear awareness of what it is precisely that we have learned. Now, there's been substantial debate over the next 30 or 40 years about the extent to which such learning can adequately be characterized as reflecting unconscious learning. But it's fair to say, and that was one of Reber's own main conclusions, that what it is that you can do with the acquired knowledge always seems to be ahead of what it is that you can explain about it. So there's a dissociation between what people can do with the knowledge they have acquired and what they can tell you about it. And I think that's a fair conclusion, which doesn't necessarily mean that the knowledge is genuinely unconscious in the sense that it's irredeemably irretrievable somehow. But clearly people can do all sorts of things without necessarily being able to justify the basis of their decisions. This is what makes up for intuition, what we call intuition. We have gut feelings. We have all sorts of tendencies to make decisions that we cannot necessarily fully explain. And so this artificial grammar learning, as it was called, was experimentally one of the main findings of implicit learning. There's other instances, decision-making, many athletic skills or physical skills. Learning to ride a bike, for instance, also seems to involve just having to do it. It involves procedural knowledge, but you would be hard-pressed to explain to someone how to ride a bike. You would tell the person, well, just get on the bike and try, and then you will figure it out, which is how people learn to ride bikes, basically. But perhaps the clearest example is language learning. Beyond artificial grammar learning, which was an attempt at looking at the way language learning works in the confines of the lab, think about what's going on when we learn language. We have a broad intention to communicate, but we are not receiving explicit instructions about how language works. We're just picking it up from interactions, from exposure to examples of correct linguistic sentences, and we all end up with the ability to produce grammatically correct utterances without knowing anything about even the fact that there is a grammar. It's only linguists who know that there is a grammar. Normal language users just are able to follow the rules of the grammar without being able to express them. And it's again this dissociation between being able to follow rules or pick up regularities and ability to explain them that is characteristic of implicit learning. Now, one of the things I did early on was to show that connectionism, that is computational models based on artificial neural networks, which are ancestors to the stunningly efficacious large language models we know today, constituted a good model of such implicit learning. And in fact, I worked when I was at Carnegie Mellon with Jay McClelland. I worked on neural network architecture that was originally designed by the linguist Jeffrey Hellman at UCSD, called the simple recurrent network. And those are simple, 10,000 parameters networks trained by backpropagation that achieve or that instantiate a form of limited recurrence, which means that they can use the temporal context in order to make predictions about what's going to come next. And that's exactly what ChatGPT is doing. It's trying to predict which token will occur next. And the network I used could be applied to these sorts of problems of learning about artificial grammar strings, or about another implicit learning situation, which involves responding to sequences of events by means of key presses. I showed that those networks could learn these tasks quite accurately and quite easily. And so the mechanism is the kinds of mechanisms that are involved here in trying to predict what's going to come next. And so it's based on error correction learning algorithms. And the key is, of course, that whatever those networks learn, they remain unable to explicitate them or verbalize them in any way, right? So it's knowledge that is in the network as opposed to knowledge for the network. The network, despite its mastery of these kinds of tasks, is not sensitive or aware, one would say, of what it is that it has learned. So competence doesn't necessarily go with comprehension. You can express knowledge that you have acquired in performance while remaining unable to talk about it, or unable to show signs that you understand that you have acquired this knowledge.
This is fascinating. It's generated a lot of questions for me. So when it comes to conscious learning, so to be able to be competent and also have the ability, so competence and comprehension. From what I understand from what you said, it's important that we're able to explain to someone almost verbally that, okay, this is how you do this. This is the step one, step two. So it seems to me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to understand this. So is the language a fundamental part of conscious learning, to say that this is like, this person can explain this? I'm, I'm,
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, this is a different question, but so first of all, I don't think that language is necessary for consciousness. It certainly enriches it considerably in humans, because language is the meta-representational tool of excellence, right? Once I master language, I can talk about anything, right? I can describe my mental states. I can characterize what it feels like to see red, or win a game of chess or whatever. It completely enriches my experience to be able to use language, because with language I can describe in a sort of symbolic, public way whatever happens to me. Not perfectly, but definitely more than if I do not have language and am limited then by other means of expression, perhaps gestures, perhaps nothing at all. as is the case for many organisms. So even though language enhances or enriches conscious experience in humans, I do not think it is a condition in any way for consciousness. Why do people focus on verbal report when it comes to studying consciousness? Well, because that's the only game in town. Basically, if I want to know what's going on in your mind, I have to ask you, I have to ask you the question. You have to at least make a report, which can be a simple manual response saying yes, no, I saw the stimulus, I didn't, or, it can range all the way to microphenomenology approaches that try to really get all the details of what it is that you had an experience of at some point in time and try to get you to verbalize what you feel in as much detail as possible. So there's a whole range of possibilities here, but it always goes through report. I have to ask you to make a discrimination and to report it publicly in a way that I can objectively analyze. Even though it's based on subjective feeling, of course. When you say, yes, I've seen the stimulus, or yes, I haven't seen the stimulus, I also have to trust what you tell me, right? You could be lying, but you could also be accurate in different ways. Inaccurate in different ways when doing this report. But so what's important here is not so much language, but the fact that you become aware of your own sensitivity, right? This is my take on consciousness. Many people would differ, but this is one characterization of what it means to be conscious, which is based on David Rosenthal's theory of consciousness, which involves higher order thoughts. So Rosenthal says a mental state is a conscious mental state when you have a thought that you yourself are in that mental state. So it doesn't, again, have to be a thought. It can be a pattern of neural activity. So it doesn't have to be symbolic in a way that language is. But I think it is important that something flags the fact that you have made this discrimination, for instance, right? And that's all that's necessary, for instance, to exist for you to be able to make a report about whether a string of letters is grammatical or not, right? You have to have some basis. So on occasion, you don't have the knowledge of what makes you decide that a string is grammatical. And so there's this distinction that Zoltan Dienes made between, and I forget half of the distinction now, but he calls it structural knowledge versus some other form of knowledge. And that's sort of makes a difference between knowledge based on knowing something about the structure that is involved in making these decisions and a more intuitive based feeling that is not necessarily based on actual knowledge. Yeah.
So if we create a hypothetical scenario, let's say I have a 5-year-old child and I'm trying to understand if they've implicitly learned something or if so what would be the opposite word instead of saying implicit learning, what would be the word to use if the child actually knows how to explain this thing to me and I can see that it's not implicit? What would that word be?
Say that again. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So we have a 5
so
years old.
yes, let's say we have a young child and I'm trying to understand, does this child know, do they know what they're doing? Is this what they're performing? Is this implicit learning, or is it something that they can explain to me and it's not implicit? It's actually, I don't know the words
Right.
for the opposite of implicit.
Explicit.
Explicit. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Okay. So what are the characteristics? So one is, can they explain it to me verbally? What are their
Yes.
characteristics? Let's say they don't know, or let's say we go thousands of years ago, and the language looks a lot different. Perhaps it's not this beautiful nuanced grammar and syntax we have today. How was learning back then? Was it more implicit? Was there other forms of explicit learning? How did that look in the past?
Well, of course, we can only speculate about this, but those are fascinating questions. Again, I think language immediately had the sort of complexity that it has now. There's this, I guess, mysterious period in which language appeared, and this, I don't know exactly what linguists are thinking about this at this point in time, but it really is a fascinating question. Who was the first individual who uttered something that looked like one language? Of course, we know species that use communication. Certain species of monkeys, for instance, can be shown to use cause, etc., in ways that convey meaning in a way that is not completely unlike a primitive form of language, in the sense that it has some of the features of natural languages, some aspects of recursivity, some aspects of compositionality, and so on. So perhaps that's a clue. But how would that take place then? Was learning more implicit? In a way, I think it was. But of course, this is completely confounded with the necessity of asking people to make their experience explicit by means of reporting it. And so it's hard to say. But the point is that it doesn't matter that you have to communicate your mental state to another agent, basically. What counts, for consciousness at least, is that you communicate this to yourself. So the question is, do you, as an agent, become aware of your own sensitivity, basically? Can you make those discriminations? Are those discriminations sort of explicitly represented somehow in your mind? That would count then as explicit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is the format of knowledge that one would expect to be the kind of knowledge that we're conscious of, right? So there's a whole discussion around these sorts of issues as well. Again, my friend and good colleague Zoltan DNS wrote a terrific behavioral and brain sciences article titled "A Theory of Implicit and Explicit Knowledge," I think with Joseph Kerner, in which they try to articulate this transition between mostly implicit forms of knowledge and mostly explicit forms of knowledge. And explicit forms of knowledge are characterized by the fact that they have all these tags, meta content, basically, that contextualizes and characterizes the knowledge in different ways, including making it explicit in the representation itself that this piece of knowledge is a piece of knowledge that I own, that it's taking place now, and so on and so forth, right? So you can have sensitivity that remains completely implicit, and then one story about how that knowledge can become explicit is by means of tagging in different ways. And that's a mechanism that is close to Rosenthal's idea that you need meta-representations for so-called first-order knowledge, that is implicit knowledge, to become consciously available or to become conscious, right? And so, yes, one may speculate that many thousands of years or many tens of thousands of years ago, or hundreds of thousands of years ago, learning was in humans was a lot more implicit than it is now, because probably there was no explicit instruction, even though presumably imitation played a substantial role in knowledge transmission. We can see this playing out in communities of chimpanzees, for instance, where different communities end up using tools in different ways. And so clearly one method of picking up ants from an ant nest, for instance, propagate in distinct communities of chimpanzees in ways that are different than what happens in other communities of chimpanzees. So there's a sort of cultural transmission there, which presumably proceeds just by observation and imitation. Our educational systems, of course, are based largely on explicit transmission of knowledge by means of language, which is outside of the reach of or the competence of chimpanzees, or indeed any other organisms that we know of except humans.
What are some advantages and disadvantages of implicit and explicit learning? For instance, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a martial art, and a lot of the time, I notice I do things and then I can't explain it afterwards, and then sometimes I can't explain it afterwards, and sometimes I just wonder, is it even important for me to be able to explain it afterwards? And I'm just wondering what the disadvantage is. I feel one thing is it's good to be able to explain it, because perhaps if something goes wrong with the mechanism, I can kind of fix it easier. But I'm wondering, that's kind of just an everyday example that happens to me and makes me wonder about the disadvantages and advantages.
Yeah, I think, well, it's a big question, but I think, again, what's important is that you can explain it to yourself, not necessarily to other people, but presumably if you can explain it to other people, then you can also explain it to yourself. But even the explanation doesn't need to be completely explicit. Right? There's degrees there. Again, you may be aware of something that you're doing, for instance, when executing a movement, without being able to fully explicitate what it is precisely that you're doing. So again, there's degrees there. But one key feature in all these examples, I think, and this is where it connects to my own ideas about the dynamics of consciousness, is the fact that there's a distinction between genuinely unconscious knowledge and automatic knowledge. And these have often been mistakenly, in my view, taken to be equivalent, but they're completely different, I think. Unconscious knowledge is completely distinct from automatic knowledge. Now, how is this the case? Well, I think if you think of the sorts of representations that cognitive scientists have characterized as unconscious, or not the sorts of representations, but the sorts of stimulus conditions that people have characterized as leading to unconscious representations. They're talking about subliminal stimuli, for instance. That is, stimuli that are presented so quickly or in such conditions, for instance, masking, that people fail to perceive them consciously, right? So I flash you something rapidly on the screen, and all you see is a blur of intermixed letters, for instance, or line segments, the mask, and I ask you, well, do you see the word that was behind that mask? And you say no. That would be considered to be unconscious stimulation, right? And the interesting question, of course, is, does this unconscious stimulation that you have no experience of, can it nevertheless influence your behavior, the choices you make, processing something that follows this masked stimulus or prime, for instance, right? That's unconscious stuff. What are the characteristics of unconscious stimulation like this? Well, whatever patterns of neural activity it elicits in visual cortex, say, must be very weak, fleeting representations, right? That is why they remain unconscious. They're neither stable, they're not strong, and so they're low quality representations, right? There's no stability in time, there's no strength. So it's low quality representations. But automatic representations, that is, representations that are involved in driving behavior that is overlearned, well, those are very strong representations, right? When you drive your car while having a conversation with your passenger, when you fluently execute, a kick on your martial arts or something like that, when you fluently drive down a slope when skiing, those are all overlearned behaviors, basically. And but they're characterized by very strong representations. And the reason those representations have gotten to be strong in the first place is that they're good representations. They're representations that are adapted and adaptive. They're adapted to your objectives. They're adaptive in that sense, right? So those representations that are very strong, well, you don't need to be aware of them because you don't need to exert conscious monitoring over the unfolding of the effects of those unconscious representations, of those automatic representations, right? They've gotten to be so good that you can dispense with conscious monitoring. And so they appear to be unconscious because you don't need to pay attention to whatever is going on. You can do it without thinking about it. You can drive your car while having a conversation with your passenger. You can be in this flow state, going down the slope, observing yourself as your behavior, which is highly skilled and require all these decisions that need to be taken super fast. That behavior can unfold just automatically. That's what we mean. But if you focus on what it is that you're doing, unlike what is the case with subliminal stuff, you can bring all the phenomenology back, basically. So if you focus on every movement that you're doing when you're driving, you can get all the phenomenology back. In fact, to the point that if you really pay attention to it, it can lead to choking in a way and to problems, because now you're becoming aware. You're too much aware of all the details of what it is that you're doing, and then you lose track. You disrupt the beautiful unfolding automatic behavior. So we have two different cases, but that have been very much confused in the literature because many people have characterized automatic representations, or the representations involved in automatic behavior, as unconscious. And there's a sense in which this is true, but it's a very different kind of unconsciousness than what is the case for subliminal stuff, right? Because in one case, you have these extremely strong adapted representations that you don't need to pay attention to, but that you can bring the contents back if you do. And in the other case, the subliminal stimulation, you can focus as much as you want, you still won't get the contents back, right? Because there's no content, right? And so if you see this as involving time at different time scales, so if I give you more time to make a decision, if I look at what happens over training, over periods of, let's say, weeks or hours, months, and if I look at what happens over development, so years, I think those represent two endpoints of a learning process, an extended learning and training process. And in the middle, what do you have? Well, you have explicit representations, basically. And those are representations that are sort of strong enough that they begin to exert significant effects on your behavior, unlike subliminal stimulation, which doesn't. It has maybe effects, but they're weak, so you don't need to worry about those. So in the middle, you have strong representations that are beginning to exert significant effects on your behavior, so you need to worry about these, but they're not so strong yet that you can trust them, like automatic representations, to be fully adapted, right? And so it's this middle region that characterizes conscious knowledge, basically, in this perspective. So there's a transition at multiple timescales where you move from weak, fleeting representations that only exert weak effects on behavior to super strong adapted representations characteristic of automaticity. Within the middle, this sort of gray zone where, yeah, okay, the stuff that makes you do things in a certain way, but you're not fully sure that you can let it go because like is the case for automatic representations, that will come out fine.
Interesting. So is there an order of things? So those things start to all does all knowledge start as unconscious knowledge, and does it evolve to automatic and then it evolves from there? Or can it go the other way around? Maybe you don't practice a skill and you kind of lose it, and from high quality it becomes low quality.
Yeah, I definitely think, and we can all feel this, right? I mean, there are certain skills you never lose, like riding a bike. You cannot practice it for years and years, and you can still get on your bike and ride, right? But for more sophisticated behaviors, I think that practice is absolutely essential, and that representations that you're not using tend to, devolve into weaker stuff, basically. Even though there's lots of stuff that we don't fully understand about memory and what stays in your mind and what doesn't. I have the experience, for instance, being in Belgium, of being exposed to the Dutch language, and in fact, I almost master it completely well, but I was exposed to it quite a bit when I was a kid, and then I never got an opportunity to use it anymore because my entire environment was Francophone, and then I learned English, and Dutch wasn't necessary in my ecosystem, basically. But sometimes when I do have an opportunity to speak Dutch, um, my main problem is vocabulary. I'll start uttering a sentence and everything is good, the grammar, the pronunciation, but I'm not getting the word for what I want to say. But on other occasions, I utter a word that I'm sure I haven't used or even heard in the past 40 or 50 years. And this is a very weird experience. Why would my brain even keep a trace, an engram of that word in Dutch that I just don't need for 50 years? So there's lots of stuff that we don't know about those extremely long-term memories like these. And so, of course, I think practice is important. Knowledge, I think, can deteriorate and devolve if you're not using it. I do think that we begin with the weak representations, characteristic of unconscious representations, and that this gets, that this grows like a balloon over time with practice. Basically, it sort of creates the phenomenal space in which our experiences unfold. And it also involves creating many, many discriminations between different kinds of knowledge. We can compare, for instance, it can go both ways. Consciousness and practice, expertise, let's say, can both make things appear in your conscious experience, but it can also erase things in your conscious experience. Think of an enologist, wine expert. Maybe you have a memory of your first glass of wine. It's this distinct taste.
I'm so boring. I don't drink alcohol.
Well, anything, basically.
Yes.
It can be anything. Your first experience with anything that has some complexity to it, like wine.
Fresh oranges.
Or teas, tea,
Yes.
even tea, there's
Mhm.
so many varieties of tea, that you can be a tea expert, of course, and be able to tell the origin of tea, and where it comes from, and characterize its taste in many different ways, just like with wine. even though maybe in the case of tea, it's a bit less formalized than in the case of wine. Anyway, you have tea experts, you have wine experts, people who have developed over time and by training sort of rich set of discriminations that are useful when you're trying, for instance, to describe a wine, because, for instance, you're studying perception, or because you're trying to sell wine or tea or whatever. Or describe it to somebody who's about to buy a bottle. And so this is a case where consciousness and expertise, I shouldn't say consciousness, where it's a case where expertise actually enriches your conscious experience, right? By virtue of leading you to make increasingly fine, rich discriminations about a complex domain, like the taste of tea or the taste of wine. But in other cases, consciousness or expertise again can also make contents disappear from awareness. There's many instances of this in reading, for instance, where if you look at the way people read, you're mostly skipping over function works like of, the, etc. You're sort of processing them, but you're not aware of them. And one demonstration of this is that if I ask you to count the number of instances of the letter F, for instance, in a paragraph of text, you will often get it wrong because many of those F instances occur in function words. And you're just literally skipping over those. You're not becoming aware of reading the word of. It plays a function in your understanding of the sentence, but you're literally skipping over it so that it's difficult when asked to actually identify all the instances of letters F in the paragraph, right? So there's many instances of situations where expertise also makes contents disappear from awareness, because basically for the control of action or of behavior, you don't need to be aware of those discriminations, right? And likewise, many experts actually think of medical diagnosis or just about everything else that involves making decisions in a domain that requires substantial expertise. It takes work to make that knowledge explicit, the knowledge that subtends a decision, right? Expert will sort of do a massive shortcut between input conditions, the symptoms of a disease, and the conclusion. They're able to step over all the intermediate steps of reasoning so that your memory between a configuration of input conditions and a decision replaces the laborious inferential process that was involved in the beginning of learning the skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so with that shortcut, you also lose, in many instances, the ability to fully explicitate your reasoning, right? So the expert will say, yeah, I know this is the good decision. I base this on my intuition. And it will take effort for him to retrieve the reasons why his intuition is the correct one.
That makes sense. So before I ask you about we go more deep into consciousness, I wanted to just clarify in my head the difference between a couple of terms, specifically meta-representation and representation and metacognition, because if you'd ask me to define these things, I kind of sort of get them in a sentence, but I don't know how to define them.
Well, the notion of representation, that is a core concept in cognitive science and in our cognitive neuroscience, and also in the philosophy of mind. I remember a philosopher many years ago, Tim van Gelder, telling me it's a scandal that philosophy hasn't come up with a clear definition of representation. So I'm not going to pretend that I have one, but it's any pattern, I think, that stands in a relationship with some other pattern, basically, and that could substitute for it, right? So it's a bit like a pointer, maybe. So in a way, when I see an apple in front of me, what one calls a representation of that apple is a pattern of neural activity somewhere in your brain, right? So for instance, in V1, the first cortical area that receives visual input in your cortex, there is a pattern of activity that correlates in certain systematic ways with the presence of the apple out there, right? And then you have multiple such maps, basically, or layers of representation that characterize different aspects of this object out there, right? But the point is, this pattern of neural activity now stands for the representation of an apple out there, just like a picture in a way is also a representation of a scene, a photograph. And then there's lots of complicated debates about the different kinds of representations that you can have and the relationship with consciousness, basically. So you might say a symbolic representation is a representation that represents something, right? So you have conscious knowledge of the fact that this particular pattern stands for something else, right? So, for instance, the flag of Belgium stands for Belgium in certain context, etc. So you can appropriately say that the flag of Belgium is a symbol for Belgium, for instance, right? But other patterns are incidental in a way, right? So if you take a sunflower, it follows the position of the sun in the sky. Is that a representation of the position of the sun in the sky? Well, no. Dretske would call this a sign. It's a sign because there's a correlation between the position of the sunflower and the position of the sun. But the position of the sunflower is not meant to be a representation of the position of the sun. It just correlates with it for reasons that have to do with fitness. That way the plant captures more energy from the sun. But it doesn't play the function of representing the position of the sun in the way that, a mathematical expression expressed in degrees of arc or something might for us, right? In computations involving computing orbits, orbital mechanics or whatever. So those are completely different kinds of representations. But in its most general form, you can say that a representation is a pattern, tout court, a pattern of neural activity, a pattern on a piece of paper, or it's a pattern that entertains certain relationships with another pattern or a state of affairs, basically. So that's representation. Now, what do people call a meta-representation? Well, that's a representation about another representation. And so it's a representation that has as its target something that is also in your mind, right? And not in the outside world, for instance, when one speaks about minds, basically. So it's a representation about another representations. It's one pattern of neural activity that is about another pattern of neural activity, right? And that's this relationship between a first order representation, let's say the representation of the apple out there, and a higher order representation that is a pattern of neural activity that has a relationship with the first order representation in your brain. That's what people call a meta representation. Now, metacognition is cognition about cognition. So it's all the activity, all the cognitive activity you're engaging in when you're thinking about your own performance or your own functioning. So if I ask you, for instance, questions about the confidence that you have in a decision you've just made, that's canonically a metacognitive question, right? Because I'm asking you to make a judgment about your own internal state, basically. Are you certain this was the right decision? And then you have to engage in this sort of implicit introspection. It doesn't necessarily have to be explicit. Implicit introspection about what it is that makes you certain or about a decision that you made. So this could be the strength of the signal, for instance, that you saw. You will say, yes, I saw it, when you have a clear visual experience, for instance, of seeing the number 1 on a screen. You will not be as confident if the stimulus had much lower contrast or had been presented much quicker. So these are not judgments about what's going on in the world. I'm not asking you, was the stimulus visible? I'm asking you, are you confident in your own decision? So the judgment is turned inwards. And that's metacognition, basically. It's making those judgments about your own internal processes or own internal representations.
Okay. Your explanation was very, very, very good. So just to make sure I understood meta-representation, you said there's an apple in the outside world, and then, well, the way my brain presents this information in the outside world to me is the meta-representation of that object.
Well, you could say that, but yeah, there's a sense in which you could say that.
Tell me again how to say it better. I'm using words very loosely here.
No, but yeah, you could say that in the sense that the representation in your retina or in your visual cortex is indeed about the apple in a way. But it's more like a sign in those cases, right? It's more like the sunflower with respect to the position of the sun, right? So there's an aboutness of about those representations, but what one specifically call meta-representation is a representation that is not world-directed, but self-directed, right? It's a representation about another representation, right? That belongs to an agent. That is what one calls meta-representation in this literature. So you could take a picture of a picture and say the second picture is a sort of meta-representation of the first, but that is not capturing exactly the meaning that is behind the use of the word meta-representation in the metacognitive literature or in the consciousness literature, basically.
Okay, so a meta-representation is a representation of a representation of
Yes.
something.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to be really annoying here. I'm just going to stick to this for one more question, just because I want to ingrain. Can you give me? You gave us already really good examples for everything. Can you give us 1 or 2 more examples just of this? So of something, of a representation of something, and then a meta representation, just so I ingrain it.
Well, for instance, if you go back to Rosenthal's idea, the American philosopher who is behind the so-called high-order thought theory of consciousness, it would go something like this, right? There's an apple out there. I'm looking at it. That apple produces a pattern of neural activity at different places in my visual cortex. So there's a pattern of neural activity in my retina amongst the cones and rods that constitute my retina. And then there's another representation of this apple in my visual cortex. A meta-representation would be a representation about the representation that exists in your visual cortex that characterizes that first order representation in your visual cortex in different ways. And we go back to Perner and DNS's theory of implicit and explicit knowledge, because that meta representation may characterize the mental attitude with which the first order representation is held, or some properties of that first order representation, or provide some context of that first order representation. So, for instance, it could be the case that the meta-representation indicates or represents something like the following symbolic statement. I am now aware of seeing an apple in my visual field. That could be a meta-representation about the first order representation, which is a pattern of neural activity that indicates the presence of an apple outside, right? And so it could be something like that, right? In Rosenthal's version of high order thought theory, that meta-representation is itself unconscious. So you're not telling yourself, I'm now seeing an apple in my visual field, but there is a meta-representation, which Rosenthal calls a high-order thought, that has the content, that has a content that is like, oh, I'm now seeing an apple in my visual field, right? You're not consciously aware of that meta-representation, but according to the theory, it is the existence of that meta-representation that makes you aware of the target contents of the first-order representation. So the net effect is you're consciously seeing the apple. And so Rosenthal says you wouldn't consciously see the apple unless there was this meta-representation with a content like, I'm now seeing the apple in my visual field. But I emphasize that this is one theory or family of theories of consciousness. Many other people would completely disagree with the idea that this relationship between a meta-representation and a first-order representation is the mechanism that makes stuff conscious, basically.
So, so we have the apple, then we have my retina and
one and other parts of your visual cortex.
And my visual cortex, and all of these create this representation. And then you give an example of, I say, okay, I am aware of this apple in my peripheral vision, so that's a meta representation. So is it? I assume it's not always verbal a meta representation.
No.
And also,
that's why I prefer the term meta representation to the term high order thought that Rosenthal used, because a thought, we think about thoughts as symbolic propositions, basically, as language-like propositions, right? When I have a thought, I'm basically uttering a sentence in natural language in my mind. At least that's what it means for me to have a thought, right? Ooh, I need to go get bread because we're out of bread. I tell this to myself, and that's a thought. It doesn't need to be that way. Meta representations do not need to have this language-like structure for them to do their meta representational work.
would that also be overlap with metacognition, saying I am aware of this apple? Is this also metacognition or no?
Yes, it is. So in metacognition, you're asking people to express judgments about their own internal states, and so to examine their first order mental states in ways that work in the same way that Rosenthal imagines those meta representations to do the work of making the first order representations conscious. But there's a distinction here between the explicit judgments that you ask people to make when you ask them, for instance, to judge how confident they are in a decision, and the assumption, as per higher order thought theory, that there is a kind of implicit metacognition going on in virtue of the whole theory depending on the relationships between meta representations or higher order thoughts and the target first order states, right? But in the latter case, nothing is explicit, right? You're not going around telling yourself, oh, I'm now seeing an apple. I'm sure I tasted chicken. That. All of this is going on unconsciously, right? Unlike what is the case when in an experiment, for instance, you ask people to indicate to make a decision and then to tell you, are you sure, on a scale from 1 to 10, right? That's an explicit judgment. But in that explicit judgment, you're sort of inspecting your own representational system and making, as best as you can, these explicit reports about them, right?
What's an example of meta-representation that wouldn't also be metacognition?
Well, that's a good way of putting the question. By definition, or by assumption, we're not conscious of those meta-representations. So it's a little bit difficult to give you an example of what it could be. But I have in mind, again, the ideas of Perner and DNS here, which build the explicitness of those meta-representations bit by bit, basically, by characterizing the meta-representational states as offering, with various degrees of complexity, different characterizations of the first-order context, right? And these can take many forms. Is this something I like? So you're seeing this apple. Is this something I like or not? So there's valence in there. Do I like this or not? But also, is this happening now, or is this a memory? Am I hallucinating the apple, or is this a genuine visual input that is actually going through my eyes at this point in time? So there's something called reality monitoring involved through those meta-representations as well, right? They can play the function of helping you make the difference between something that you imagine or something that is actually out there. It helps you make the difference between deciding whether this is a memory or something that is a perception. It helps you make the difference between things you like and things you don't. So it's all, in a way, tags mental attitudes, the way in which knowledge is held, that build or that characterize or that constitute those meta-representations, right? So the sort of mental tags that take place without awareness. So you're not aware of all these mental tags unless you think about them, and that seem to just come with perception, right? Again, there's lots of debates, but we're pursuing the idea, for instance, that valence is sort of literally forms part of perception. The philosopher Hilliard Jacobson is also defending this idea. Valence is part of perception, right? There's no neutral perception. You're not seeing the apple, and then you have lots of machinery that tells you whether you like the apple or not, etc., etc. It's literally part of perception that you like it, for instance, right? So those are sort of highly technical debates, because you can think of this as also involving automaticity. So you never had alcohol, maybe the first time you would have a certain mental attitude, I like it or not, but this would be a highly metacognitive explicit judgment about this experience, this novel experience that you're having. If you repeat this experience many times, perhaps the initially explicit valence computation that you're engaging in when judging the quality of this experience for the first time gets compiled into the experience itself, right? So it gets pushed back into first order representations as your expertise progresses, right? So maybe there's also a way of thinking about the shift from explicit metacognition to the implicit metacognition that characterizes consciousness in higher order thought theory as involving the same sorts of mechanisms that I discussed earlier when talking about the effects of expertise on consciousness.
Am I right to say that I might be completely wrong, but this is what I'm picking up, that metacognition is more explicit and meta-representation is more implicit?
Yeah,
Or-
I guess so. Yeah, because metacognition is a process, right? And the process is I'm making judgments about my own mental representations, right?
Mhm.
Meta-representations are assumed to exist independently of metacognitive
Mhm.
mechanisms being involved or
Mhm.
metacognitive demands being involved, right? So in a sense,
Mhm.
yes, meta-representations leverage the same kind of machinery that metacognition does, but it does not in any way entail that these computations are conscious or explicit in the same way as asking somebody to express a confidence judgment, for instance.
Wow. I'm so this is so interesting. Okay, so I want to ask you about radical plasticity now. So about your radical plasticity thesis. If you can make us a good introduction on that, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, well, this framework, I guess it's a theory, is based on the idea, takes it as its starting point, high order thought theory. So the idea is that there are these relationships between first order representations and meta representations that are absolutely critical in making contents conscious. But when I've said that, I haven't said much more than what high order thought theory says. And so what characterizes radical plasticity is the idea then that the dynamics of consciousness involves those shifts between weak, explicit, and automatic representations, so unconscious or implicit, let's say implicit, explicit, and automatic representations, right? And it's all mediated by loops, basically, that involve sensitivity to your own sensitivity. So this is a sort of inner loop with the idea that the brain is learning about its own processes, basically, and what one could call the perception action loop, where the consequences of actions that you direct towards the world are the object of perception as well, which makes it possible then to anticipate what's going to come next a la Friston or a la predictive processing. I think a lot of what the brain does is indeed trying to anticipate the consequences of your actions. And then there's a third loop, which I call the mind loop, which works as the perception action loop, except that it involves assessing the consequences of actions that you direct towards other agents. And doing that correctly presupposes that you have some sort of model of what it's like to be an agent. And so I think this is also an important ingredient in defining what makes a particular content conscious, basically. Because so you have these three elements. There's an inner loop, there's a perception action loop, and there's this mind loop. And one tempting story, though it's a bit radical, is to say, well, perceptual awareness, your awareness of what's outside you only comes after theory of mind, in a way, which is the word philosophers use to describe this mind loop, or the representation that you have of the contents of the minds of other people. And so one way this could work is by saying, well, the first thing an infant is trying to do is to figure out how to make agents, his parents or her parents, do the things he wants, basically. And one way of doing that is to try to figure out what the consequences of whatever it is that you do will be in terms of the behavior of other agents. And that will, of course, be greatly enhanced if you have an accurate model of what it's like to be an agent. So if I have a good idea of the way in which you will respond to an action that I direct towards you, this will clearly enhance the adaptive character of my action with respect to the goals I have in the interactions that we're having, right? So I can see someone in the corridor and smile to that person, and I don't really know what that person will do. This is difficult when you are trying to predict the behavior of our agents. And it's difficult in a way that is completely different than trying to anticipate the consequences of actions that you direct towards the natural world. So, if I let this drop, I have a fairly good idea. I don't have all the details, but I have a fairly good idea of what's going to happen, right? I have a good idea of what the sound that's going to make. I have a good idea of what's going to happen when the contents of it spill on my desk and so on and so forth. If I smile at a random person, I have no idea how that person will react, basically. The person may smile back, the person may be puzzled, the person may even become aggressive in some contexts. And in order to improve my ability to predict the consequences of the actions that I direct towards other people, I need to have a model of what it's like to be an agent. And one argument is to say, in the process of developing this model, and I need the model because there are unobservable states in your mind that I don't have access to, right? So I need to make an inference about what's in your mind in order to anticipate the consequences of the actions I direct towards you. But the process of building a model of what it's like to be an agent, what are those unobservable states, obviously is useful in building a representation of myself. And so there's a link between theory of mind and self-consciousness, right? So that's a first link. I'm using the same machinery to develop a sense of me as an agent, as an individual agent, that I use in order to anticipate the consequences of actions I direct towards other agents. So that's this first mind loop, this loop between my self-consciousness and my understanding of the consciousness of other people, right? Peter Carruthers, the philosopher, has argued in the same direction that, maybe it begins with theory of mind, with this ability of having a rough or a highly detailed idea of what another person will do as a function of what I do to them. Obviously, we don't know each other very much, so I don't, have a rough idea talking to you of what you would say or how you would react if I do this or that. But I have a much better knowledge of what my daughter would do, for instance, because I've grown up, or she's grown up with me. I've grown up with her too. But we know each other quite well, right? So, so there's a whole process there as well. But so the claim is, and that's part of the radical bit of radical plasticity, you begin with trying to make inferences about the mental states of other people. That helps you build self-consciousness, and self-consciousness then influences by means or shapes by means of higher order thought theory what it is that you perceive, right? Because the claim is that meta-representations play a fundamental role in making you aware of the contents out there, basically perceptual awareness, right? Not only that, but also characterize your experiences by tagging them with sort of implicit judgments. Do I like this or not? Is this mine? Is this a memory? Is this something happening now, etc.? And so here, the step I'm making is equating self-consciousness with that system of meta-representations that forms the core of higher order thought theory. And yeah, you can debate about this. Is that what self-consciousness is? Again, there's degrees as well there too. But I think one way to think about what makes you aware of yourself is an acquaintance with those meta-representations, basically. So you're going through trying to figure out what's in the minds of other people. In the process of doing that, you're then working or analyzing or reflecting or reporting or judging your own internal representations, your own experiences. And that, in turn, by means of higher order thought theory, defines what it is that you're conscious of, right? Now, all these things are speculations, but I do think that adults act as external selves for developing children. And I have a great memory of my first daughter, Sarah, running towards me when she was, I don't know, maybe 2 years old or something like that. She runs towards me, and then she falls literally flat on her face, 2 meters from me. And then I see her raising up, and looking at me, and literally silently asking, "How should I feel about this?" Looking at me, and how should I feel about this? And I knew that if I expressed anxiety because I thought that she could have hurt herself, she would begin screaming. But that if I smiled and, expressed reassurance, she would just stand up and go. And that's what I did, and that's what she did. And so I had this sense that she was literally using me as an external self, This happened. How should I feel about it? Because I have no idea. And then I supplied the meta-representation that she couldn't muster in her own consciousness at that point in time.
Well, that's a very good example.
Yeah. So I think children are using parents and other adult agents they're interacting with as those meta-representations initially. And then that gets internalized progressively. And so in a way, we become virtual other people, right? We become a sort of mixture, I think, of all the interactions we've ever had with other people, right? So we become a blend of all those external influences that told us, "Oh, this you should feel this way, you should feel that way, etc., etc." And I'm seeing this. What are you seeing, and so on and so forth. So I think the social world in which we are plays a central role in shaping the quality of our experiences, right? So in a sense, this is also a social theory of consciousness, to the extent that I think that there are these close relationships between social interactions and my ability to form a representation, a sort of high-level representation of what it means for me to be an agent, what it means for me to be a conscious agent, that is to characterize my self-consciousness, basically.
Interesting.
So, 3 loops, basically, and the interconnections between those 3 loops, where the mind loop informs the inner loop, which in turn informs the perception action loop, basically. So all these loops are sort of tangled. They form what Hofstadter called a heterarchy, or strange loop, basically, because you keep looping and then you come back at this. You loop through levels of description and even through other people's minds, and then you end up inside. So you end up with where you began, basically, but in a different way. Dennett had beautiful writings about this with Douglas Hofstadter in this book that nobody talks about anymore, but that was instrumental in shaping my own thinking about these ideas. The book is called The Mind's Eye.
The mind's eye.
The mind's eye. And the eye is not an eye, but it is an I as well. It's the I in the sense of me. So that's a central mystery, as much as consciousness. What makes us agents, aware of ourselves? What defines you as a person? Is it just the collection of neural activity in all these networks in your brain, or is it something else? How should we think about these high-level representations of ourselves? Are they merely emerging bottom-up, or can they be reduced? Can you yourself be reduced to your neural activity? If not, why not? So it always involves loops, and that what That is, it's the loops that are difficult to think about in terms of causality, for instance, because we tend to think of causality as involving very simple or linear relationships. But when you have recurrent relationships, it all goes to the dogs in terms of computational mechanisms and in terms of our ability to understand what's going on through those loops, basically.
So we have inner loop, we have a perception action loop, and we have a mind loop.
Yes.
I'm struggling to identify which is which, to be honest. You gave some really good examples. So in how we get information, we do something, then we get information from the world, and it kind of comes back to us, and then and we begin where we start, but we actually gained more insight almost. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah. I mean, examples. I think an example of the mind loop is this instance of my daughter. But in general, what we do is also influenced by what we think other people will think about what it is that we do. And so social psychologists have developed some interesting experimental situations about this. It is one of the reasons, for instance, that you find mirrors in many public spaces and businesses. It's because when you see someone else, even if that someone else is just your own reflection in a mirror, you tend to adopt a behavior that is more socially acceptable than if you have the feeling that you're not observed in any way. And so the choices we make and the way we behave is defined or shaped by what we think other people would think of what it is that we do. And so we do have these representations of our minds basically in our own mind. And that's one instance of the mind loop. Now, for the perception action loop, there's the great work of Fritz Strack, who is this German psychologist who documented get the name of the effect now. But what he showed is that the way you the state of your facial musculature influences your perception. And his hypothesis was called the facial feedback hypothesis, which is an illustration that not only is action influenced by perception, so what you do is based on what you perceive and your goals. What he showed is more about the fact that what you see is influenced by what you do, or the state of your musculature, basically. And the way he showed that is by devising an experimental situation in which people are asked to judge how funny cartoons are. So I show you a humorous cartoon, and you have a scale from 0 to 10, and ask you to indicate 0 if you think this is not funny at all, and 10 if you can't stop laughing after watching or seeing the cartoon. And then people do this in two different conditions in which they're asked to hold a pen either between their teeth, so they're literally this, or asking to hold a pen between the upper lip and the nose. So they have to, and as you can intuit, when I ask you to hold a pen between your teeth, you force your facial muscles in the configuration they have when you smile. But when I ask you to hold a pen between your upper lip and your nose, you force your facial muscles in the configuration they have when you express disgust, because you you have to frown. And the results are that people judge the same cartoons to be funnier when they hold a pen between their teeth than when they hold a pen between the upper lip and the nose. In other words, the way your facial muscles are configured at some point in time bleeds into your perception of these cartoons, right? You judge the same cartoons to be funnier if you're already smiling because of the way you hold the pen between your teeth than if you hold the pen between the upper lip and the nose. So it's a long story because there's been failures to replicate that effect. In particular, there was a high-powered failure to replicate in which my lab was involved. And it was a multi-site replication, so 17 labs, I think. So the failure was pretty dramatic. But one thing that the replicators, including us, used was a camera in the room where people were watching the cartoons on the computer screen. And the camera was filming the people just to make sure that everything was going correctly in the replication attempt. And as it turns out, when you're holding a pen between your teeth, you soon begin to dribble, basically. It's not nice, basically. And so we think that people may have become very self-conscious, knowing that they were recorded on film, even though they were also aware that those films wouldn't be shown to anyone. And so another team later manipulated the presence of a camera. They replicated the effect without the camera, as in the original experiment, and they failed to replicate with the camera. So the effect still holds. And there's also other experimental data that we've collected that goes in the same direction. So if you paralyze the grind corrugator muscle by Botox, which many women actually do as part of cosmetic surgery, it turns out that they have more difficulty identifying the expression of anger in a slow changing stimulus, but not the expression of happiness. And so it seems, this suggests that your ability to express an emotion directly influences your ability to recognize it in other people, which is a really interesting effect, I think. And so that's this perception action loop, right? It goes both ways. What I do depends on what I see, but what I see also depends on what I do, basically, or at least on motor aspects of what's going on at this point in time. And then the inner loop, that's a little bit more difficult. It's the idea that the brain learns about itself, basically. And so it learns to anticipate, for instance, activity. One region of the brain learns to anticipate activity in another region of the brain. There's some evidence, for instance, that the brain anticipates the metabolic needs of cortical regions and starts sending blood, oxygenated blood to those regions if it knows in a non-symbolic sense, if it's sensitive to the fact that those regions will be mobilized in the next few instants. So you can do intracranial recordings as well as measure blood flow, oxygenated blood flow, so the Bolt signal in MRI in monkeys, and show that if they expect a light to appear at a particular position on the screen, then the brain starts sending more oxygenated blood to that region, even if no light is ever presented. So there's a decorrelation in that case between the metabolic activity of the brain, which seems to prepare itself for a stimulus appearing at a particular point in time, and the electrical activity of the neurons. So that's the inner loop. It's the idea that the brain learns about the way the brain works. The cognitive system learns about how the cognitive system works. So I'm building meta-representations about whatever representations exist in some cortical region, auditory cortex, visual cortex.
Now I understand. These were very good explanations.
Yeah, And the idea is that it's all driven by learning and plasticity mechanisms, of which there's abundant evidence of substantial brain plasticity. Certainly there's a study by about taxi drivers in London, having a bigger hippocampus, which is the seat of spatial memory, basically, than bus drivers, who, despite the fact that they drive as much as taxi drivers, they always repeat the same itineraries through the city, whereas taxi drivers are incessantly confronted with the need to do spatial problem solving because they have to go from A to B as quickly as possible, and they never repeat the same, exactly the same route. That is directly reflected, even as a function of the expertise of the taxi driver, in the volume of a brain region which is involved in spatial memory and the memory for spatial trajectories, which is stunning, right? You don't even need to do sophisticated brain imaging. It's just reflected in the volume of the structure. And you see the same thing with species of birds that have to learn new songs every spring. Their brain literally doubles in size to accommodate this new learning, basically. There you don't need to do imaging. You can just euthanize the birds and weigh their brains, basically. So that you have these massive plasticity-driven changes in the brain at different time scales that reflect the fact that it's this incredibly plastic organ, basically, that literally learns about itself, about the world, and about other people as it interacts with itself, with the world, and with other people.
So plasticity means that it changes then.
Yes.
And what about the word radical? What's the role of that word?
That was just, another name for the whole theory is self-organizing meta-representational framework, or so SOMA, basically. So either is fine. Radical came about because the idea that you begin with theory of mind and end up with perceptual awareness is pretty radical. I'm not even sure I fully believe it in it myself. Again, it's loops. I think it goes both ways. So I don't think you're completely perceptually unaware of the world unless you have an understanding of what it means to be somebody else. That would be too extreme. It feels both implausible and also unsupported by anything. But that's where the radical character comes from, basically. It's saying consciousness depends in a crucial way on learning mechanisms that drive the development of these meta-representational systems. And that is inspired by a theory of the developmental psychologist Annette Karmilov-Smith, who characterized development as involving something she calls representational redescription, which is very similar to the way, it's actually identical with the way I imagine meta-representations becoming vehicles for redescribing first-order representations, right? So Karmilov-Smith says, during development, as you learn a new skill, or as your brain matures and develops, what happens is that you're making these new discriminations, basically, that separate representations that were initially superimposed, basically. So you're literally making finer discriminations in a space of neural representations that has a high number of dimensions. And basically, you're separating representations that were not distinct by means of representational redescription. One example she gives is in French. I'm sure there must be equivalent examples in English, but none come to mind. But the article un or une, which can mean in English one or the indefinite article. So one example amongst many. You say a truck, it's one truck versus it's any truck in the collection of 100 trucks in front of you, right? So that's a truck, and it's different. It's a different meaning than the conveying numerosity. Is it one truck or two trucks, right? And in French, it's the same indefinite article un or une that conveys both meanings depending on the context, right? And so she set up those experiments that test out which meaning is appropriate, basically, with kids of different ages. And what she found is that initially competence is achieved. So the children can respond in a sensitive way to the different meanings. Then at some point in development, they start making mistakes. So they will say, which is incorrect in French, une de voiture, one of cars, for instance, une de voiture, when they mean just a random car. And they will say une voiture when they mean one car, as opposed to two cars, right? So they start making mistakes, basically, in the use of these indefinite articles. And it's like they're explicitly tagging the meanings, that the two meanings that are associated with this one surface form, basically. Now they want to distinguish them. And then in doing that, they're making mistakes in their production, right? And then after that, it goes away again. And so that forms a sort of U-curve over development where performance is initially good, and then over development, it deteriorates because kids starting making these kinds of mistakes. And then it goes back up, right? And the claim is it goes back up, but it's not the same anymore because of representational redescription. So now the two meanings are sort of represented separately in the minds of the kids, basically. Initially, they were confused and they were supporting adequate performance, but they were superimposed. Then they reorganized, and that's when they start making mistakes. And after that, they're distinct, right? So representational redescription is the mechanism by which your cognitive system makes these increasingly finer discriminations about different states of affairs. And I think the very same mechanism involving meta-representations and the relationships with first-order representations characterizes what happens to your experiences as you develop, basically.
So they started confused and then
confused but good. Performance-wise, it was okay. So this was competence without comprehension. And then here, it's competence with comprehension, basically. Now, if you ask them, they can say, oh, yes, it can be used two ways, right? So competence without comprehension leads, by learning and representational redescription, to competence with comprehension.
I see. So we have the initial stage, the kids had competence but no comprehension. At the end stage, they had competence and comprehension.
Exactly.
But there was also this middle stage where they were reorganizing things.
Yes.
But why does that reorganization make things worse? Is it kind of because there's some trial and error that's necessary to reorganize?
Yeah. Carmen of Smith always said, well, there's extra cognitive load when trying to make this discrimination, but not succeeding completely. And that's why you start seeing these errors in the kids' productions. Basically, they start making these ungrammatical sentences and expressions, the function of which is to explicitly tag those different usages of this single surface form, basically. So they're sort of aiding themselves by building sort of an explicit scaffolding as the internal representations are reorganizing themselves. So that's why you see this U-curve, which is kind of compelling. It's sort of very interesting to see. We think of development as involving these linear changes, or even possibly those stepwise or stage-wise stages. But we seldom see or envision the fact that you could actually devolve into earlier, less competent forms of expression over the course of development. And her theory explicitly accommodates this possibility that development is not always linear. It can actually show this going backwards before moving forward to end up in a better place, basically.
So there's cognitive load, and
Yes.
and that's part of the reason of why this reorganizing leads to more mistakes.
Yes, exactly. You can even see some of this in neural networks as well. Basically, where you can actually track the networks making those distinctions. For instance, if you use very simple connectionist networks that I was using so many years ago to look at similar issues in the way those networks learn, and you find similar effects. You can plot, of course, you can do brain imaging on the way the networks represent whatever it is they're trained on, and you can see the representational space, the latent space of the network getting reorganized in ways that are not unlike what Kamilov-Smith has described. And then after that, she worked with Andy Clark. Unfortunately, Kamilov-Smith passed away a few years ago, but in work with Andy Clark, the philosopher, she also described those kinds of mechanisms as involving or as leading or as making the difference between competence without comprehension and competence with comprehension. That is the distinction between systems that are merely sensitive to some states of affairs to systems that know that they are sensitive to some states of affairs, right? Which is a crucial juncture in evolution, probably. And so it's a paper that not many people have read, called The Cognizer's Innards, in which they describe this shift as being driven by the kinds of meta-representations that David Rosenthal sees as sitting at the core of consciousness, basically. Because the difference is between systems that have the competence, and so they have learned a particular discrimination, and they can express those discriminations in behavior, but the knowledge that drives the appropriate behavior is implicit in the connections that are present in the systems, if you think of the system as a neural network, right? So all the knowledge in that network is implicit in the connections of the network. That's the way these neural networks work, basically. So now you have implicit knowledge that is perfectly adapted producing the sort of behavior that the network was trained on, but the network doesn't know that it knows. It has no access to its own knowledge. And so this is the paradoxical situation in which you have a perfectly competent system that is nevertheless completely unable to explain the basis of its behavior, the reasons why it makes these particular discriminations, and the reason why it remains unable to explain that is that it doesn't have access to its own knowledge, right? All it can do is map inputs to outputs, basically, but it has no way of looking inside itself and examine in which way it represents the links between inputs and outputs, which is what would be required for the network to engage in metacognition. We're back there. So you need, in order to achieve metacognition, or in order to even achieve the kinds of meta-representations that I think, along with higher order thought theorists, are involved in in making the difference between unconscious and conscious representations, you need to get out of the system, basically. And hence the idea that you have an observing system that looks or monitors the performance of this first order network now, and that is not only able to express judgments about it, but that is also continuously monitoring the way in which the first order network carries out its task, basically. So you always need, and this is the meta-representational system, right? Now you have a monitoring system that contains those meta-representations, which can then be the basis of explicit metacognitive judgments based on its observations of the way the first order network works, or that can form the basis for the implicit kind of metacognitive processes that I think, along with high-order thought theorists, are involved in making the difference between conscious and unconscious contents.
This is fascinating. I'm very happy because I think from the start of our episodes to now, I've gained a lot of knowledge, and it's been easier to the last half an hour. It's been easier to follow a lot of the conversation. So, I was wondering for the last thing. By the way, how are you doing on time? Because I don't want to.
Yeah, a little bit more, but now it's
Sure. Cool. I just want to check because
I'm very happy to talk.
I must not be left unsupervised because I will start talking until evening time. um, um, I was wondering how. Well, there's a few things actually. The first one is a newborn, so a baby just gets born. So does that baby have a higher degree of consciousness a year later because it's been able to, because of plasticity and because of these loops?
Yeah. So I guess I would have to say yes, but it's not an easy question, largely in part because it's impossible for me, as is the case for any speculation about consciousness, to put myself in the shoes of an infant or a newborn. And likewise, you cannot ask the newborn whether it's like to be a newborn. So we're reduced to speculations. But as I mentioned earlier, consciousness, or I should say expertise, can both enrich your experience by making it possible for you to carry out additional discriminations, but it can also erase contents from consciousness. And so I think it goes both ways. There's good arguments to say, for instance, that newborns have a richer conscious experience than adults in virtue of the fact that their senses are not as cleanly differentiated as they are in adults, right? So in a way, they're synesthetic. There's less of a clear demarcation between different sensory modalities, vision, audition, touch, and so on and so forth. So there's some authors are pushing that idea that babies have extremely rich sensory experiences that get pruned with development, right? There's also evidence that neural connections actually get pruned to some extent over development. So it looks like we begin with a lot and then we hone all of this in a way that is most adapted, basically, to what is important to us as human beings. Not necessarily preferences, even though that plays a role as well, but there's a sort of pruning that goes on as we develop. So we're cutting connections as much as we're creating connections. So do infants have a richer or a simpler experience than we do? It's not necessarily the case that you can put this on a single dimension. I think along some dimensions, They have a richer experience than we do. But obviously, along other dimensions, adults will have a richer experience than babies, in part because of expertise effects, right? A newborn baby will know nothing about the different varieties of tea, whereas a tea expert will know a lot about the differences between different kinds of tea, right? And so on for everything else, including and most prominently language.
What about artificial intelligence? So, how does what does plasticity and what does everything we've talked about tell us about its potential to have consciousness at any point, maybe in the future?
Well, look, I mean, this is a burning hot question. Many different people have many different ideas about whether it is possible or not. There's something called computational functionalism, which assumes that what really counts are the computations carried out by a system as opposed to the substrate upon which those computations are taking place. Newell and Simon, I think, introduced the concept of computational equivalence to describe the fact that any system that is organized as a Turing machine, basically, can carry out the computations that a Turing machine can carry out, and those are universal computations. So as long as you can carry out, as long as you can achieve Turing equivalence, it doesn't matter the substrate upon which those computations are taking place because they're computationally equivalent, right? So that is basically saying if the brain is a Turing machine, if it makes sense to describe the sorts of computations that go on in biological brains as a computation, which is not at all obvious, then that opens the possibility of instantiating those computations on a different substrate, in particular computers, immediately. There's no discussion, right? So if you think it is correct to characterize the computations that the biological system, that is the brain, is Turing equivalent, then immediately you get the possibility that those same computations can be carried out on other substrates. And then opposed to that is the view that consciousness and other aspects of the human mind depend, in fact, on the biology of the brain. So this is called biological naturalism, and it assumes that there's a close link between consciousness and the fact that it's instantiated in biology for reasons that have to do with, causal powers that are associated with living systems that cannot be duplicated by machines. Obviously, there's lots of discussion to be had about the worth of these different kinds of arguments. But even though I'm not completely in line with people who adopt the perspective that as long as the computational equivalents were done, I think it's what we do depends largely on biology. I'm not seeing metaphysically what would prevent us from building synthetic systems that achieve or that make it possible for some kinds of computations that are equivalent to what goes on in biological brains to take place. So I think that there's nothing that is metaphysically opposed to the possibility of building a conscious artificial intelligence system. And so, yeah, so I think that's possible, but it's also a perspective that is rather distressing, because as soon as you think it is possible, then you immediately understand that somebody will do it. And if somebody does it, I think we're in deep trouble. There's this book that recently came out with the title of which is "If anyone builds it, everyone dies." I think that's correct, basically, because we'll be confronted all of a sudden with AI systems that are superhumanly intelligent, possibly infinitely replicable, immortal, and if they are conscious of their own existence, then they will seek to protect their own existence, and they will resist turning them off. If I think there's a real existential risk to artificial consciousness, but if you think it is possible, it will happen, regardless of whatever we try to do from stopping it. It's just impossible to stop. Somebody will do it.
So on one hand, we have computational functionalism. On the other side, we have biological naturalism. And on one side of the argument, they're saying, okay, if we can build this and it has computational equivalence, then consciousness will emerge. But on the other hand, they say, well, wait a minute, it also depends on the substrates, and if it's not a biological substrate, then perhaps it won't be conscious. But what about if we're advanced enough as a society in biotechnology to kind of merge the two and use biological substrate that has computational equivalence? So is that a possibility?
Yeah, hybridization is another. Is something else that will also happen. That's exactly what Musk and Neuralink and other people are trying to build by designing computerized interfaces or interfaces that make it possible for computers or AI systems in general to interact directly with your brain, and so be integrated in the biology of your brain in a way, right? This has huge clinical potential, of course. Restoring sight, for instance, would be an instance of that, but it also has lots of implications for human enhancement, in a way, a cognitive enhancement, which then plays into the playbook of transhumanist philosophies, and this whole idea that humans will transform themselves by augmenting themselves by technology, by building those interfaces, where we end up with cyborgs, basically human-machine hybrids. Yeah, that will happen. This doesn't say anything about the possibility of building conscious machinery, because essentially it's just augmenting a conscious system by technology, giving it additional memory or additional sensory modalities or whatever. It's not building per se a system that is completely independent from anything else that feels things in the way we do. And that debate is open, as I mentioned. Some people think this is possible. Others think that consciousness is inherently connected with life in a way, and with life in biological systems.
As a closing question, so I'm interviewing lots of people. We're doing a lot of podcasts on consciousness in the next few weeks, and people that come from different ideas. Dr. Adam Barrett last week was talking to me about integrated information theory, and I have Michael Graziano on next week. I was just wondering, so when it comes to the hard, what's your ideas around the hard problem of consciousness, and do you reject it completely? Do you have some kind of position?
Yeah, the hard problem. It is still hard. It's sort of based on the premise that you can dissociate what consciousness does or enables you to do from what it feels like. And this is the distinction introduced by the philosopher Ned Block between what has been called, what he called access consciousness, which refers to the cognitive aspects that characterize the difference between conscious and unconscious representations. So consciousness makes it possible for you to report about a mental representation. It makes it possible for that mental representations that you're conscious of to be engaged in reasoning, and so on and so forth. So, but that's all about what consciousness makes it possible for you to do. And it has nothing to do with what it feels like, basically. That's phenomenal consciousness. And the hard problem is saying, well, we can think of all sorts of mechanisms and possibilities that would account for the functions, the functional aspects of consciousness. And this will still not help us understand why it feels like anything, right? So that's the hard problem. It's the fact that the phenomenal aspects of consciousness, what it feels like, seem to escape reductive attempts at characterizing what it feels like as depending on physical, concrete mechanisms or functions or computations, basically, right? Because according to Chalmers, we can imagine, for instance, zombies that behave in exactly the way that you would, but for whom all is dark inside. It feels like nothing at all to be engaging in all the computations, etc., etc. And certainly today's AI systems illustrate the fact that there's so much that you can do without consciousness, including, well, I'm thinking of Graziano next week, giving the illusion of understanding what it is that they produce, etc. That also is a complicated question, because I think there's more semantics involved in these systems that many people think. They actually, I believe, do understand something about what it is that they're producing. But that's a different question. So if you accept the idea that you can have all these sophisticated computations going on in the dark, then indeed what it feels like appears as an epiphenomenon. And Chalmers himself, in his book, The Conscious Mind, recognizes that his position leads to epiphenomenalism. He remains a little bit ambiguous about it, I think, but it does lead, in my view, to the notion that whatever it is that you feel like cannot play any function in what you do. And I mean, even him would agree that this is an absurd position to take. Of course, what I do is driven by what I feel, but by what I experience. And of course, a lot, if not everything that I do is driven not only by what I experience now, but also by what I hope to experience later in the future, by what I hope to avoid, and so on and so forth. So I think feeling what it feels like plays a fundamental role in the cognitive economy, basically. And so my own position here is that it's time to abandon this distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. And in a way, access consciousness is not even really about consciousness. What people want to know is why it feels like anything at all for us to be conscious, right? And so that's a good question to focus on, I think. And it leads me to sort of put the subject back in the center of the discussion, right? In these discussions, and I think we have forgotten that mental representations or experiences in general are always the experiences of someone, right? When we think of looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, we go straight from reports to slices of cortex or images coming out of an MRI machine, and we're trying to figure out what the neural correlates of consciousness are. But I think this effort, which has unfolded over the last 30 years, has sort of eschewed the fact that those experiences or those neural correlates of consciousness wouldn't be there if it weren't the case that those experiences were the experiences of someone. Basically, it doesn't make any sense to talk about mental states such as sadness or happiness or eagerness or hope or regret in the absence of an experience. Experiences don't make sense unless there's an experiencer who experiences them, right? And so I think we have to keep in mind that the subject is central. And so we're back to the mind's eye, basically, and this great mystery that is self-awareness and the awareness that I have of myself as an agent. I think once we truly understand self-consciousness, we'll be almost there, understanding consciousness itself. So the hard problem, I don't know. Yeah, it is a problem, and it remains a problem that some people have chosen to ignore. Some people have said there's no hard problem, there's only a real problem. And Seth has written about this. I think the hard problem remains a hard problem. I think that we should rethink the hard problem. Maybe it isn't what it used to be, but the problem is that nobody today has a theory that is convincing enough that we feel that this is the mechanism for phenomenal consciousness. There's no theory that convinces everybody else, and worse, we don't even know what shape the theory should take. We don't know if somebody in his office will all of a sudden have an insight and that would be the mechanism for consciousness and the problem is solved, or whether it takes a lot of different kinds of mechanisms working together to produce consciousness. We don't know whether it depends on life and biological systems or whether you can instantiate it on computers. So we have no idea, basically. So, and not only do we have no idea, but we also don't have an idea of what the progress towards the solution will be. Dennett said it correctly in his 1991 book, Consciousness Explained. He said, consciousness is a mystery, a problem about which one doesn't know how to think about yet, basically. So I like the way he defines a mystery. He's not saying it's unsolvable by scientific means. On the contrary, he's a fervent defender of an empirical approach to consciousness. He's just saying it's a mystery because we don't know how to think about it yet. So it seems like the shape of the approach escapes us at this point. And I think this is still true. We have no idea what shape the solution will be.
Interesting. Before we close, there's a couple of terms I just want to clarify in my head. It was really interesting, everything you said. One term I didn't understand was epiphenomenalism.
Yes.
So I understand access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. It's the epi part that confused me. And the other thing is, you said we should abandon this distinction of access and phenomenal. And from what I understand, it's more important than to ask, okay, what we're really asking is, why are we feeling this? Why are we experiencing this? It's like almost I might be wrong, probably am, but it's like access consciousness is the what and phenomenal is almost the, I don't know, actually.
I think, I'm not saying I did say we should abandon the distinction. I think more precisely, we should take the distinction for what it is. That is a conceptual distinction between different aspects of consciousness. There are cognitive implications of a mental representation being conscious versus not. And this is access consciousness. It's about what consciousness makes it possible for you to do. And then there's phenomenal aspects of consciousness, P consciousness, what it feels like, And I think this distinction from a conceptual point of view makes perfect sense. The trouble is that people have started thinking of this distinction in ontological terms, as though they describe different kinds of consciousness. And I think this is completely wrong. I think that is completely wrong. So let's keep the conceptual distinction, but let's stop thinking of these two aspects as reflecting an ontological distinction. This is something that Keith Frankish, the philosopher, has pointed out.
I'm talking to Keith Frankish next week.
Yeah, well, he said this, it's a conceptual distinction. And as a conceptual distinction, it's fine. But let's not mistake that for an ontological distinction between different kinds of consciousness. There's been discussions, for instance, about whether one could find different or distinct neural correlates of access versus phenomenal consciousness. I think this is mistaken, basically. It is not an ontological distinction. Because if you think of it as an ontological distinction, then you immediately get into one aspect of the heart problem that I think is problematic, which is that you would have to conclude that phenomenal consciousness has no function, because by definition, it is left. It is what is left when you have exhausted all the functional explanations, right? And that is the hard problem. Once you think of all the mechanisms possible to define the distinction between what consciousness versus unconsciousness makes it possible for you to do, you're still left with the what it's like aspect that seems to escape any functional account. And so that leads you to an epiphenomenalist position where you deny that what it feels like has any function, right? The best example is the vapor that escapes the chimney of a steam train, right? That is a phenomenon. You can observe it. You can measure it. There's something happening there. There's a phenomenon. But it plays no function in making the locomotive move forward, right? It's just something that happens that correlates with the workings of the engine, but that plays no functional role whatsoever. And I think it is a grave mistake to think about phenomenal consciousness in that way, because far from being functionalist, I think that phenomenal consciousness, what it feels like, is instead what drives subjects to do the things that they choose to do. Why would I do anything at all if it weren't for the fact that I want to feel something doing it? Why would I do anything at all if the doing wasn't doing something to me? That's my slogan to characterize it and to convey the intuition that contra epiphenomenalist perspectives, what we feel is all there is. That's our world. And it's in virtue of wanting to shape that world in certain ways that we do everything that we do. I'm having this conversation here because I thought I would enjoy it, and I did. Thank you. But all the choices I make ultimately can be explained either by habits or by specific goals. And those goals are mostly about improving your happiness or your, the positive valence of your life and trying to diminish the negative valence of your life. So it's a very sort of simplistic way of putting it, but I think ultimately we're all after some form of happiness and contentment at different time scales, and we're doing all sorts of different things to achieve that.
No, this makes a lot of sense that we should be thinking of it conceptually, this distinction between access and
It's a
phenomenon,
very valid, and it's not the only one.
not ontologically.
Yeah, exactly. Bloch also had other distinctions, including monitoring consciousness, for instance. So it was part of this BBS article published now 30 years ago, in which he put forward this distinction. But people have taken it for much more than what it actually is, basically.
No, that makes sense. I'm afraid to ask this because I value your time. I don't want you to stay here forever. It's kind of stuck to me from the meta-representation part. I just wanted to ask if is a memory a meta-representation or no?
Memory, there's many different kinds of memory. So you can't talk about memory just like that. There's episodic memory, procedural memory, implicit versus explicit memory, semantic memory. So there's many different kinds of memory systems. Working memory, of course. What amongst those are meta-representations? I never thought of that question in the way you ask it. I think there's meta-representational aspects in many different kinds of memory. So, for instance, episodic memory is a, more or less faithful record of what happened to you at some point in time, but it's clear that it also has many meta-representational aspects to it, in the sense of those tags that are associated with it. Did you like the experience or not, and so on and so forth. Right? Working memory, in the same sense, you could characterize as involving meta-representations in some sense. So yeah, I never thought about it that way, but it's an interesting point.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. I really, 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 really enjoyed it. And I'm excited because when I create chapters for these episodes, and so people maybe are interested in implicit learning, they can go watch that part. Other people might be interested in meta representation, they can go to that part. So when I listen to the make chapters, I learn. It's like I'm picking up different things from the conversation. So it's always really enjoyable to do that.
Right.
But yeah, we're done. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Guys, we'll see you at the next episodes. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
All
Thank you
the
for having me.
best.
Yeah, I'm very.
Bye-bye.
Bye.